After quitting Genshin Impact for over a year during Natlan's release, the only reason I finally decided to return to the game was for Durin. I loved Durin during the Similanka event where he first debuted, and his relationship with Scaramouche was one of my main attachments to the game. So now that he's officially here and his kit leaks are out, here I am to cover everything related to one of my newest favorite characters in the entire game. But first, a word from the sponsor of today's video. LD Shop is a safe and reliable top-up site that allows you to buy currency across multiple different games, including Honkai Star Rail, Genshin Impact, among other games. They offer prices at a discount, from anywhere up to 13% to 25% cheaper than topping up in-game. Not only are the prices cheaper, but they make topping up completely effortless. All you need is your server and game ID, and you're good to go. No hassle at all, and no personal information required whatsoever. After purchase, you can see that the Jades are sent to my account within 5 minutes. There are no downsides to using LD Shop for your purchases, as the prices on LD Shop are strictly better than the prices in-game. But the upsides don't stop there. Users who register using my link in the description below will get an exclusive 15% and 5% coupon, which can save you up to $50. Additionally, if you spend $80 in total, you can earn an Express Supply Pass for completely free. If you want to top up at discounted prices with no downsides, using a website and method that has been approved as safe by multiple large content creators in the space, then click the link in the description below to head over to LD Shop and start saving money on your gacha game top-ups right away. So let's just jump straight into it, starting with a brief rundown of what his abilities do. Durin is a 5-star Pyro Sword user with a kit focused around dealing off-field pyro damage. His closest comparison is going to be Xiangling. Both of them even use their elemental bursts for most of their damage. Given his role as an off-field sub-DPS, his normal attacks are obviously nothing special, although they do have some really cool animations that I can't show in this video. Durin's elemental skill is where things get interesting. When he presses elemental skill, it deals very small pyro damage and then allows him to choose between two different forms. We're going to call them white mode and black mode. You select the form by either using his skill a second time or using his basic attack after his skill. Do note that it doesn't actually change his basic attacks. Pressing the basic attack is just an activation method to select white mode or black mode. Entering white mode or black mode doesn't actually do much for Durin's elemental skill. Instead, his mode affects his elemental burst. So his skill is essentially just a setup for his elemental burst. It does also give him around 30 energy on cast, which is a hefty amount and single-handedly causes him to no longer suffer from the same energy issues you would expect from Xiangling. So that's nice. Durin's elemental burst is where his entire kit is. His elemental burst has two different modes, obviously depending on whether he entered white mode or black mode in his skill. If Durin uses his white mode elemental burst, then his elemental burst will deal AoE pyro damage from off-field, similarly to Xiangling's burst. If Durin uses his black mode elemental burst, then his elemental burst will deal single target blasts of pyro damage from off-field. In other words, Durin's white mode or black mode just changes whether or not his burst does AoE damage or single target damage. But there's a bit more variance in his two different modes coming from his passive talents, which we'll discuss next. Also, his elemental burst costs 70 energy, but again, his skill instantly refunds 30 energy, so it basically only costs 40 energy. If you're wondering why they wouldn't just make it cost 40 energy to begin with, instead of this super roundabout way of reducing his energy costs, the reason is because all elemental burst cooldowns are related to their energy cost. Every elemental burst that costs 40 energy has a 12-second cooldown. Every burst that costs 60 energy has a 15-second cooldown, and so on. Therefore, they gave Durin a 70 energy cost burst so that it's forced to have an 18-second cooldown. But they don't actually want him to have energy issues, that's why his skill refunds 30 energy. Basically, it was to gatekeep his cooldown, that's all. The cooldown isn't an issue for his uptime, since his burst lasts for 20 seconds, meaning you'll always have it active, so it's not a huge deal. But that's the explanation for why they made it 70 cost with a 30 energy refund, instead of just making it 40 energy from the get-go. Now to get to his passive talents. Durin's first passive talent differentiates his white mode and black mode into two distinct roles. When Durin is in his white mode, and anyone on the team triggers a pyro reaction, he reduces the resistance of all elements associated with that reaction by 20%, with an exception for Hydro and Cryo. He cannot reduce Hydro and Cryo resistance, meaning Vaporize and Melt cannot benefit from his resistance shred. Only Dendro, Electro, Geo, Anemo, and of course other pyro characters can benefit from this resistance shred. However, this doesn't mean he's useless in Hydro and Cryo teams, because that's where his black mode comes in. When Durin is in his black mode, instead of shredding resistances for the team, he instead increases his own Vaporize and Melt reaction damage by 40%. So, to break this down for you, Durin can select to enter his white mode or his black mode via his elemental skill, just depending on which button you press, meaning you always get to choose which one you want. Durin's white mode makes his burst deal AoE pyro damage from off-field with 100% uptime, and he can also shred resistances for any element that isn't Hydro and Cryo. This is a more supportive mode that mainly focuses on utilizing Durin for his off-field pyro application and resistance shredding capabilities. Durin's black mode makes his burst deal single target pyro damage from off-field with 100% uptime, and instead of having supportive capabilities, AoEs, he buffs his own vaporize and melt reaction damage. In other words, if you're looking for an off-field pyro support, Durin is meant to fulfill that role for non-hydro and cryo teams. But in hydro and cryo teams, he's meant to amplify his own damage instead of the team's damage. This doesn't mean you can't utilize his different modes in different teams, but these are the two intended playstyles for him. And his second passive talent just amplifies his damage even more, no matter which mode he's in. But obviously, your question is, how does he compare to the likes of Xiangling? He's a 5-star, so he should be better, right? And, well, it's a little bit complicated. Xiangling is notoriously a very powerful 4-star character, so the fact that he's in the same conversation as her is already good on its own. In terms of damage output, Duran has better multipliers than Xiangling at a baseline, partially thanks to having 100% uptime on his burst, whereas Xiangling does not. Duran also has much higher base attack, and he ascends with crit damage. So all in all, at a baseline, Duran does more damage than Xiangling. However, this changes once we start taking into account vaporize reactions. Part of what makes Xiangling so strong is the fact that she can trigger vaporize on each hit of her Pyronado. When Xiangling is properly used in vaporize teams, her damage does climb higher than Durin, but when Durin is in black mode, and assuming he's triggering vaporize at a standard rate, meaning slower than Xiangling, since Xiangling is sort of a special case, Durin's damage once again climbs higher than Xiangling in vaporize teams. It should be noted that in his black mode, Durin is purely single target, while Xiangling is AoE. However, there is a fix to this. If you need to deal with AoE scenarios in a vaporize team, then you can just choose not to use Durin's black mode. Obviously, you lose out on his larger personal damage and his own self-reaction damage buffs, but his multipliers in his white mode are good enough anyway that it'll still compete with Xiangling in AoE. So essentially, the comparison between Duran and Xiangling is like this. In non-reaction teams, Duran's multipliers are just better than Xiangling's. In vaporized teams, Duran's multipliers are once again better than Xiangling's, but he's locked to single target in his black mode. If you use his white mode in vaporized teams, he's no longer beating Xiangling by a large amount, but he's still very similar to her since he's now able to deal AoE damage just like her. All in all, in most scenarios, Duran's damage is going to be competitively an upgrade to Xiangling over the course of a 20-second rotation. Not to mention, Duran can technically run 18-second rotations since that's the actual cooldown of his burst. I was just comparing it in a 20-second rotation because that's what Xiangling is forced to run. It should be noted that all of this is assuming Duran has standard internal cooldown on his pyro application, unlike Xiangling who applies pyro on every hit. The last thing I want to note is melt teams. Xiangling is incapable of ever being played as a melt DPS because her pyro application is too fast. If we assume that Duran's black mode is capable of lining up properly for melt reactions, then that would become Duran's highest damage potential, since melt buffs pyro damage more than vaporize, climbing much higher than Xiangling's damage potential. Although, once again, it would be single target. Now, Xiangling's faster pyro application is still useful for enabling other characters to melt, so Xiangling still has a use for cryo characters who want to be the one doing the melting, whereas Duran wants to be the one doing the damage in melt teams. And it should be noted that Duran's pyro application is fairly slow, being similar to Dea's pyro application rather than Xiangling or even Movika. So he's not really going to be used to enable vaporize or melt for other characters, which is fine, since that's just not what his kit is meant to be. In terms of team buffs, Duran doesn't bring too much to the table. The 20% resistance shred from his white mode is all he brings to the team. It should be noted that when there are two Hexen Circle characters on the team, this resistance shred is increased from 20% to 35%. But currently the only characters who can fulfill this requirement are Venti, Albedo, Klee, Mona, Razor, Sucrose, and Fischl. So his ability to access this extra res shred is very limited. Also, yes, all of the aforementioned characters are now going to count as Hexen Circle characters from now on, which is sort of weird. It's not like Xiangling offers many more team-wide buffs though. Woba technically gives 10% attack via the chili it drops, as well as 15% resistance shred, but only for pyro. And she gives 15% pyro damage bonus on her burst at C6. So it's not like Xiangling is giving 0 buffs, but in general, her buffs are just much more restricted than Duran's baseline 20% res shred in his white mode, since most of Xiangling's buffs are only for pyro damage, and Woba isn't exactly the most reliable. Now, for those of you wondering how he compares to Movika when she's played as an off-fielder, his off-field damage is obviously much higher than hers, but Movika makes up for it by dropping a huge nuke on the enemy with her elemental burst. Movika can also provide upwards of 80% damage bonus for the team via her passive talent, plus the scroll artifact set, whereas Duran doesn't really have an artifact set as powerful as Movika's. Here's what I'll say. In teams with enough Night Soul generation to charge up Movika's burst so that it nukes as hard as possible, and if those teams provide enough buffs, or if they allow Movika to vaporize or even melt her huge initial burst attack, Movika can still pull ahead. So basically, for Natlan teams. But outside of Natlan teams, where Movika isn't able to get enough fighting spirit for her burst to nuke, Duran is much better as an off-fielder compared to Movika. And even in Natlan teams, he's still competitive for the likes of Kanish and Veressa, since those teams aren't able to set up any vaporize or melt reactions for Movika's burst. And Duran's personal damage plus the res shred he can give to Dendro and Electro should make him slot in nicely for their teams. The last comparison I want to do is to Escafier. Escafier is a recently released sub-DPS character similarly to Duran, and thus, there's a lot to compare between the two of them. First off, when it comes to sheer numbers, Escafier at a baseline actually does have slightly higher multipliers than Duran's white mode, and she's able to play in shorter rotations, since her burst cooldown is only 15 seconds. However, Escafier is fully single target, whereas Durin's white mode gives him more AoE damage and AoE pyro application. When Durin enters his single target black mode and is able to utilize vaporize or melt reactions, which are just stronger than freeze in terms of damage amplification, Durin's damage does pull ahead of Escafier. Damage aside, however, Escafier also shreds hydro and cryo resistances by a whole 55%, while Durin can only shred resistances for his elements by 20%. And obviously, he shreds every element besides hydro and cryo, which is Escafier's playground. You may look at the difference in their numbers and think, wow, Durin is so much weaker than Escafier. However, the reason Escafier's resistance shred is a whopping 55% is because she's locked to cryo hydra only teams if she wants the full value of that res shred. Since freeze teams at a baseline have less access to damage amplification compared to pyro teams, she needs to give more buffs in order to make up for it. Additionally, Durin also has off-field pyro application, which arguably has access to stronger reactions than cryo reactions, given how strong vaporize and melt are. So that's why Escafier's res shred is balanced to be higher than Durin's. The last thing to note is obviously the fact that Escafier doubles up as a healer. On top of everything else she does, she also keeps the team alive and enables Farina. Durin doesn't get to do any of that. So in terms of sheer role consolidation, he's not doing everything Escafier is doing, but in a pure sub DPS comparison, he is competitive with her while being more flexible in the teams he's able to play in and having access to amplifying his own damage much beyond hers when used in vaporize and melt teams. And to briefly touch on his weapons and constellations, Durin's signature weapon is a little bit underwhelming to me. The crit rate stat stick is very nice, but when you compare it to Escafier's signature weapon, it gives less self-buffing and less team buffing, meaning it's just worse in every way. His signature weapon also requires a second Hexen Circle character to get its full buffs, and even then, Escafier's weapon still gives more stats. However, this is only his first beta iteration, so we'll see what changes his weapon goes through. To touch upon his Eidolons real quickly, Durin C1 is quite strong, essentially giving the same Icy Quills effect as Shenhe or Yunjin for the whole team. It has slightly lower scaling than Shenhe's quills, but he gives 12 of them, whereas Shenhe only gives 5 to 7, so the overall scaling increase from Durin C1 quills is deceptively strong. Durin C2 might seem a bit underwhelming, 50% damage bonus to every element involved in any pyro reaction, now including cryo and hydro, but to put it into perspective, the C2 is essentially a free Farina burst, so think of it like that. His C4 makes the quills from his C1 have a 55% chance to not be consumed, essentially giving you more quills. Lastly, Durin C6 is just a massive defense shredding constellation. It's either 70% defense shred for himself when he's in black mode, or when he's in white mode, it reduces the enemy's defense shred by 30%, which allows the entire team to essentially ignore 30% def, on top of still giving Durin his own 30% defense shred, for a total of 60% defense shred for Durin, while also giving half of that for his teammates. His white mode C6 honestly just seems better all around, since it's barely behind his black mode's defense shred for himself, while also shredding defense for the team, but the slightly higher personal defense shred for his black mode is nice at C6, when his damage is the main focus. Overall, Durin has some pretty strong constellations, especially the early constellations, which give him much more supportive capability, while his base kit focuses mostly on his own personal damage and pyro application. And that's what Durin's kit essentially is. A 5-star Xiangling with less energy issues, who is able to match her in both AoE and single target in terms of damage, with more flexible buffs. When compared to Escafier, he does similar damage to her while being balanced around the value of pyro application compared to her cryo application, but he unfortunately doesn't have her healing. Durin is, at his core, a sub DPS who you mainly add to the team for his own personal damage and pyro application from off-field. Remember that his resistance shred gets higher when he's teamed up with a second Hexen Circle character, so he has the potential to get better for certain characters in the future, such as Nicole and Alice, or even Varka, considering the Hexen Circle title is being given to random Mondstadt characters. So I wouldn't be surprised if Varka is also grouped into that in order to push some synergy between Varka and Durin, since Hoyo loves pushing team synergies nowadays. So all in all, how good is Durin? Given that he's essentially a better version of a notoriously powerful 4-star like Xiangling, he's going to be really strong. But the fact that he's focused more on his personal damage means that I wouldn't view him as a high value pull unless you're going to be playing teams that want a 5-star Xiangling and you don't want to play actual Xiangling, since she can be a bit annoying to play with her energy issues. Durin does everything Xiangling does with more comfort, such as much easier energy requirements and full uptime on his pyro application and damage, while matching Xiangling's damage and surpassing it in many scenarios. The amount of value this will bring to your account depends on what you're trying to play, but I would honestly expect a lot of Durin's value to come in the future as we get new Hexen Circle adjacent characters who release and can benefit from his off-field pyro damage, pyro application, and stronger res shred when he's paired with a Hexen Circle character. But again, this is only the early first iteration of Durin's kit, and we're sure to get much more information in the future, as well as buffs and nerfs to his kit over the course of his beta. And I'll be sure to cover all the relevant information related to Durin, since he is, after all, one of my favorite characters. I'll continue looking into calculations for him as well, and there will be more videos about his synergies and whether or not you should consider pulling for him. So subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss out on the Durin discussion, and be sure to like the video if you found it helpful or enjoyable at all. What do you think of Durin's kit? Leave any questions down below, and I'll do my best to answer. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I can't wait to see what lies in store for my favorite Dragon Boy. Until next time!